Dr. Gregory H. Stanton is the founding president of Genocide Watch and the chair of the Alliance Against Genocide. He was a research professor in genocide studies at George Mason University and was the James Farmer Professor in Human Rights at the University of Mary Washington. He was a Berkeley Fellow at the Indian Law Institute in 1978 and 79. He directed the relief program in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, following the overthrow of the Khmer Rouge regime. He founded the Cambodian Genocide Project in 1982. While in the State Department, he drafted the UN Security Council resolutions that established the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. He was a driving force in the establishment of the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. He holds degrees from Oberlin College, Harvard Divinity School, Yale Law School, and a PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Chicago. And I couldn't be more humbled and honored that you're with me today, Dr. Stanton. Thank you so much.
Well, it's a great honor to be with you and to talk with your viewers and listeners.
I'm so excited. Thank you for especially what we're about to get into. And you and I today are going to discuss the basically neo-Nazism and what that is, and perhaps how some of it relates to some of the current events that are unfolding in our society as we speak. I know we were talking a little bit about that before recording, but if we could get into that a little bit of what that is, and how big of a problem is this, and what is neo-Nazism, Dr. Stanton?
I think it's a huge problem, and in fact, it's a worldwide problem. It's not just a problem here in the United States. It's also a problem in Europe. It's a problem in Russia. It's a problem all over the world. In Turkey, I mean, in other words, we thought we had defeated Nazism in World War II. The truth is we had not. We defeated the militarily powerful part of Nazism, which was led, of course, by Germany, Hitler, by the Japanese monarchy and so forth. But what I don't think people realized is that Nazism is based also on an ideology, and that that ideology is still very much alive and still with us. The first aspect of Nazism is its racism. Nazism is based on the concept that white people are superior to anybody else. And in fact, certain kinds of white people were the ones that Hitler and the German Nazis thought were the superior race. They believed Aryans, a particular kind of white people, were the superior white people. They didn't think Slavs quite made it, for instance. And Jews were definitely not in the chosen people that Hitler believed in. Of course, the Jews think they are chosen, but a different kind of chosenness, namely a religious chosenness. Whereas for Hitler and his Nazis, they believe that Aryans should rule the world, that they're superior to all other races, and that it is based on a racist theory that really was developed in the colonial period in the 19th century. In fact, we still use the classifications that were developed by those racists. They thought there were five races, white or Caucasian, as they called them, African, Black people, as we call them, the Asians, yellow people, as they then called them, the Native Americans, who are the red people, as they called them, and then the Aborigines from Australia. And so those five races were considered the races that de Gobineau and some of the other racist theories of the 19th century believed made up the human race. And there was a hierarchy. Whites were on top, and varying ways of looking at it, but blacks were basically on the bottom. And so you had this racist theory that was behind Nazism. Combined with that was extreme nationalism. When you combine racism with extreme nationalism, you get Nazism. And nationalism, of course, is something that has developed since basically the rise of the nation state. Before the rise of the nation state in about the 16th century or 17th century, the world was divided up in all kinds of small little units that had kings and queens and various ethnic, leaders and so forth and so on, all around the world, literally thousands of them. But then the nation states developed, especially first in Europe, and then that spread to other places in the world where the European countries exerted their domination. And the nation state then became a sort of a trans-ethnic identity that superseded these many, many ethnic identities around the world. And so that is why we currently have the nation state system since about 1688, the Westphalian Treaty and so forth, in which nation states made agreements with each other that they should basically allow whoever is in charge of a nation state to rule it as they wished and not to interfere. So that it was really designed to cut down on wars when they designed these nation states. But of course, instead, the nation state system resulted in many more wars, because then nations would have wars with other nations, and they became more and more vicious and more high powered. And so we got eventually into the 20th century when we had huge wars, world wars, in which nation states and their allies, their alliances, squared off against each other and created enormous death tolls. The death tolls from the First World War were so much greater than any other war before that. That's why we call it the First World War. And then, of course, the Second World War, people are still trying to estimate how many people died in that war. It was certainly well over 100 million. And in that, it was in a different category. It was also the first use of atomic weapons when finally the US and of course then later Soviet Union and now a few other countries have a weapon that is by nature genocidal. When you use a nuclear weapon to destroy a city, that is itself an act of genocide, because you are destroying in part a part of a national group, and it's intentional. So our bombing of Hiroshima and of Nagasaki were also acts of genocide. They were not just war crimes, they were also acts of genocide. When you combine this kind of religious and racial nationalism, and I should add, by the way, that another way to divide up the world is with religion. So if you have a religious group that considers itself to be superior and have the right to rule the world, as we did, for instance, during the Crusades here with Christianity, as we have with the jihadists in Islam, which are, by the way, a very small part of the Islamic world. Most Muslims do not believe that they should conquer the rest of the world. But when you had ISIS and some of these other groups, Al Qaeda and others, they believed that, Islam was the superior religion and therefore it should rule the world. When you combine race and religion with nationalism, you get Nazism. Communism, in fact, is a type of Nazism. A lot of people think it's a left-right spectrum. That is a fundamentally misleading way of looking at the political spectrum. It's what philosophers would call a systematically misleading expression, because it makes people think wrong. The truth is, if you're going to make it into a spectrum, it should be much more like a circle, in which one axis is attitude towards change, and the other, though, is attitudes towards liberty. And on liberty, communists and Nazis, or fascists, are really right together. They're really twin brothers. They're not opposites at all. So what we had, for instance, in the Soviet Union was a type of left-wing Nazism, really. And that's what we still have, by the way, under Putin. And now in the United, and of course, Communist Chinese basically have that same type of system. So we have half the world still under Nazi rule. A lot of people don't see it that way because they think that, oh, the communists, they're on the other side of the spectrum. No, they are not. They're actually Nazis. They're just a different type of Nazi. They have a kind of, in fact, really a Marxist religion type of Nazism. They believe, well, Marx and the communist movement really are a religious movement who believe in creating a kind of utopia that eventually will come about. So what we had here in the United States, though, was a different kind of Nazism in which the people who wanted to make the federal government have almost no ability to regulate, who wanted pure corporate capitalism, and which would allow them all to be billionaires, the people who led that kind of system. They wanted to basically wipe out any kinds of ways of regulating that. So you had the Koch brothers, you had the people who supported Hitler in this country, Henry Ford and others. You have had, in other words, a Nazi past in our country. I think that basically the system of segregation in the South was based on that kind of Nazism, in which there was a racial hierarchy, in which the authoritarian governments of the southern states would not allow Black people to vote. We also had that very same attitude towards Native Americans here in the United States, which we pushed them all off their land and out into reservations. In the meantime, a lot of them died. So we've had Nazism, in other words, in the United States already. What has happened under Trump was his attempt to, through his coup d'etat attempt, just this a couple of years ago, to actually deny the results of an election and essentially underline, completely subvert the democratic process in the United States. The parallels to what Hitler did in Germany are so striking that you have to sort of sit up and realize this is a Nazi movement that we are talking about here. And when you look at some of the extremists, of course, like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and these other groups, they are so close to the SS and the early Nazis in Germany that you realize how close we came. So that's one reason that we are so concerned about it here in Genocide Watch. A lot of people think that genocides can't happen in democracies, and they're just wrong. The truth is, genocides have happened in democracies. We've had at least a couple of them right here in the United States, in which we committed genocide, I believe, against our Native American populations. And I believe we also committed genocide against our African American populations, especially during the slave trade, in which up to a fifth or maybe even more of the people brought over from Africa died on the way. They died on the transatlantic slave trade. That's, if you look at it, and they knew they were going to die. When you look at it, that's genocide. I mean, when you know in advance that a fifth of your so-called cargo is going to die on the way over, and they're human beings, that's genocide. So in other words, we have already had genocide in the United States. The similarities to attitudes around the world is also very striking. What's happening in India right now, for instance, where you have 200 million Muslims, 200 million, that's more than the number of millions of Muslims in Pakistan. And yet now the Modi regime, which wants to appeal to Hindus in India, is trying to portray these Muslims as foreigners or as invaders, as people who don't belong in India. In fact, they've been in India for hundreds of years, in fact, more than that. So the truth is that we have some major countries now in which Nazis are basically trying to take over or have already taken over. I think, for instance, Turkey's another one. We have, a lot of countries where Nazism is still very strong.
That's absolutely incredible to me. And if you don't mind, Dr. Stanton, I'd like to touch on something that I read on your website, because when we compare the incident, the Capitol insurrection a couple of years ago to some of Hitler's methods, what I think Trump, and please let me know if you disagree with this, what I think Trump was able to successfully, if that's what you want to call it, capitalize on, was that he did not necessarily make it racial. So even though he can be racially inflammatory, I've also noticed that his some of these supporters, if you will, come from all groups. And not only that, it's come to my attention fairly recently. I live in rural Ontario. It's come to my attention fairly recently that some of these groups, that whether they supported Trump or some of the more extreme people behind our trucker convoy that we had in Canada back in the winter, some of them appear to be neo-Nazi type groups, but are actually headed up by racialized people in order to perhaps, I'm just thinking, to maybe recruit non-racist, well-meaning people, and also to divert maybe law enforcement or the media. Is this something new that we're seeing? This type of, is it fair to call it neo-Nazism? This type of thing?
Well, you know, it's a very interesting kind of disguise that is being used here, in which a leader from the targeted group is put in place so people won't accuse the group of being racist.
Right.
In fact, usually the group is racist. Usually the group has a lot of this racism in it. They'll always deny it. They'll say, oh, no, nobody's less racist than I am, or more racist. You know, it's that I'm not a racist, basically, is their point of view. It's sort of like listening to Nixon when he said, I'm not a crook. You know, it's seriously unbelievable. It's not believable.
Yeah.
And the reason it isn't is because the racism comes out so explicitly again and again and again. The attitude, for instance, of Trump, that the people coming across the border from Mexico were robbers and racists, or robbers and rapists. That's racism, and also the whole replacement theory that seems to be very typical. You know, you find that being broadcast on Fox News and so forth. The idea that somehow white people are going to be replaced by people who have darker skins. You know, people coming from Latin America who have brown skins, people from Africa who have black skins. You know, the whole idea that that US really should be ruled by white people is at the core of replacement ideology. And that very same idea has been characteristic in Europe for many, many years. I mean, it was, in fact, really invented in Europe. And I'd say that the segregationist movement in the South was based on that as well. So you had this pure racial theory that was very much present in segregationist theory. For instance, we had anti-miscegenation laws in which white people were not allowed to marry black people. And that's so similar to Nazism, in which, you know, Aryan people were not allowed to marry Jewish people, for instance. So the truth is that there is deep racism in these groups. All you have to do is scratch the surface, and there it is.
Okay, that explains an awful lot, and that kind of leads me into, I haven't met a lot of people into this ideology. I've met a couple who are very maybe surface level adherents, if that's what you want to call it. But QAnon, what is this? I didn't even realize what this was, and I've known people who have supported Trump, and I've watched Fox News before, and I didn't understand really what this was until after January 6th, when I saw all these flags, and even our trucker convoy here in Canada, I saw all these flags, and I had even asked some people that I knew had gone to this convoy, just thinking, oh, they were just against the mandates. They had no idea what was actually behind some of these things, but QAnon flags were popping up everywhere. What exactly is that? I thought it was just people who believe that there's some secret bad guys in the government. What exactly is that group? I can't logically follow what it is.
Well, it developed here in the United States, in which there was some sort of secret group who was putting out messages on, far right websites and so forth. A person who identified himself as Q. Of course, they've never quite pinned down who that is, but the ideology in QAnon is so similar to Nazism that you start recognizing it right away if you've studied Nazism. The idea is that there is a conspiracy of an elite group that intends to take all power in the world. And this elite group, in the case of QAnon, they identify it with Democrats, with especially the Clintons, with all kinds of people who, with Jewish leaders, with people who they consider to be in this conspiracy. They identify them very similarly to the way the Nazis identified the Jews. They claimed that Jewish people captured Christian children, drained their blood, used the power in their blood to mix with the liquid that they made matzahs out of, the bread they use at Passover and so forth, and then thereby gained special spiritual power through the use of this blood that they had gotten from Christian children. Well, that's exactly what the QAnon people were claiming, that pedophiles were kidnapping children, holding them in dank prisons underneath pizzerias and so forth,
Right.
and draining their blood, extracting this magical substance that apparently was going to give them power, and then they were going to take over the world. Well, I mean, it is straight out of, especially two sources in Nazi ideology. One is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which claims that Jews are aiming to take over everything in the world. And the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is, it was almost adopted verbatim in a way, not literally, I mean, by quoting or anything, but the ideas in it were adopted by QAnon, that was what was going on here in the world. There was a conspiratorial group that was trying to take all power. And then this idea that this conspiracy group was literally kidnapping children, draining their blood, and then using that for magical power, is straight out of the so-called blood libel that the Nazis used. And the blood libel, as I have already described, was one in which the Nazis claimed that the Jews were kidnapping children, draining their blood, using it in matzahs and so forth, and thereby gaining spiritual power. Both of those ideas, in other words, are very evident in the QAnon movement. Yeah. And the fact that most people didn't recognize that is that simply because, how many people have really studied Nazism? Not many.
No.
Those of us who have saw it right away. And I wrote an essay, in fact, about that. That's on our website. And I simply titled, QAnon is a Nazi cult, rebranded. That's what it is. QAnon is a Nazi cult rebranded. You can look it up on the genocidewatch.com website. It was published by Just Security. I think it's the third most cited article that Just Security has ever published.
Fantastic.
But the main point is, this is not a new thing. These conspiracy theories of this sort, for some reason, appeal to people. Now, they seem utterly irrational. How on earth can anybody believe such a far-fetched theory? Well, the truth is, a majority of the German people did believe that and supported Hitler. So, don't get the idea that people are completely rational. People aren't completely rational.
Mhm.
They will follow leaders who can convince them of such outlandish theories. And the Nazis succeeded in doing that in Germany. What I was so concerned about when the QAnon started rising, and we've got members of QAnon who are part of our US Congress. Marjorie Taylor Greene is a QAnon adherent. To have somebody like that in Congress is scary, very scary.
Yeah.
A lot of people didn't think the Nazis would have any chance at all when Hitler first wrote Mein Kampf and the Nazi movement began, in the beer halls and so forth. They didn't think they had a chance. Well, we now know that they did. And in fact, they took over the country and they took over all of Europe. And it took a world war to defeat them. We don't need that again. And that's why when you have somebody like Steve Bannon and Trump and the other people who, supported this, I believe, neo-Nazi movement, we should really be worried about it here in the United States.
I'm so glad that you're speaking on this and that you're educating people like myself and even people that have been associated with these groups who are maybe, embarrassed watching this, saying like, how could I believe that? How could I think that? But certainly the people I have spoken to personally, now I can see those parallels between the protocols of the Elders of Zion and their belief system. But it seems like in their minds, they're not thinking, that they're scapegoating anyone. They're thinking there's just these elites. It's not necessarily Democrats. It's not necessarily Jews. It's not necessarily Black people. So they may not even sort of like have come to grips with this. And so I'm so glad that I've been able to read into your work and see the sort of appalling similarities that are between these two groups, and that you've been able to see that. Now, did you see the warning signs as soon as this QAnon group really started to form? Like, did you see the warning signs right from the get-go? I was just stunned at how many people this conspiracy had captured and to the level that it had.
Well, the answer is yes. We saw it right away.
Okay, good.
But it was only because, after all, if you've been in the anti-genocide movement for 40 years, as I have, and you've really studied Nazism and you've studied how Hitler took over and the history of it, it's just jumped out at you that these people were espousing the very same beliefs and that they were using it to try to gain power. And that same thing is going on, by the way, today. I mean, it's not over. There's new types of this kind of ideology going on today, and people still aren't recognizing it. There's a movement, for instance, in conservative Christian churches called dominionism, in which, it hasn't been called that before, but the idea is that Christians have a right to rule the world, basically, and they have a special right to rule America. That America is a Christian country. Of course, that's false. It never has been a Christian country. In fact, it's written into our Constitution that it may never become a Christian country. That's why the government cannot establish a religion.
Right.
But these people believe that there shouldn't be that kind of separation of church and state, and they would like to take over the country. And they're growing. I mean, you don't believe that it's gone until it really is gone, and it hasn't gone away. So
it's something else. And is it fair, Dr. Stanton, have you seen this as well, that it seems like, at least here in Canada, it seems that with the QAnon type of movements, they have a lot of Hindu nationalist support behind them? We have a big group in Toronto that shows up to these types of protests, and they call themselves proud Hindu nationalists or groups like that. Is there a link between those groups?
There very definitely is, because the founder of the Hindutva movement in India, who founded it in the 1920s, was a supporter of Adolf Hitler. He was a supporter of the Nazis. And in fact, the RSS, the group that supports this ideology of Hindu supremacy in India, has supported it all the way through. And that is the group that is behind the current government. Modi's government, the BJP, is founded on the ideology of the RSS. And I won't go into trying to just mispronounce the name of that in Hindi, but the main point is that group has been preaching this kind of Hindu supremacy, for, well, let's see, for 100 years. And in fact, the assassin of Gandhi was a RSS extremist who, his name is Godse, and he is now being celebrated by the RSS in India. They've made statues of him and they worship him. And recently we have, for instance, open calls for genocide against Muslims in India by Hindu leaders, Hindu priests and so forth. That kind of incitement to genocide, you almost never see it that blatant, but in India it is now blatant. And so I'm not surprised that Hindu supremacists in Toronto would also back QAnon, because behind it is the very same idea that there is a conspiracy against white people, and the Hindutva movement consider themselves white people. In fact, the swastika is one of their main symbols.
Okay.
Yeah, that, there's a conspiracy against white people, Aryan people. They consider themselves Aryans.
Okay.
In fact, they have a whole set of Aryan beliefs that is very similar to Nazism. So I'm not surprised. They would fit.
Yeah, I noticed that alliance huge, and then that sort of gives the white supremacy element an excuse to say, see, we're not racist because we team up with all of these brown people of various. Okay, that makes so much sense. And Dr. Stanton,
and the thing is, ask one of those brown people if they think they're brown. They'll say no. They say no, we're Aryans.
I had no idea. I had no idea that they considered themselves an Aryan race. I had no idea. Okay,
I lived in India for a year and became quite aware of that when I was living there. Yeah, it's very strong. It's not, of course, I would say India is a very healthy democracy in some ways, because I don't think they're impossibly, well, we'll see what happens. We are very worried about India right now. Because of these open calls to genocide. And it has gotten worse and worse, actually, under Modi. But India still has an electoral democracy, and it might be able to be turned around through that.
Okay, that's I'm going to link to some more information in the show notes of our interview about that. That's so fascinating. I can't wait to research that in more depth as well. And Dr. Stanton, I won't keep you too much longer here, but one of the last questions I had for you, which is something that totally jolted me, and maybe I'm wrong. I don't know if you have any experience on this, but the most extreme neo-Nazi groups, like I'm talking, that I've ever heard of, such as the Base, such as the Atomwaffen Division, they seem to have pretty strong alliances with extremely radical jihadists. And they seem to kind of hate each other, but at the same time, they will get together, they will ally, and they seem to dress very similar. They have very similar views about women, about domination, about religion. And from what I understand, the Base means Al-Qaeda. Like Al-Qaeda is Arabic for the base. So there's clear allegiances between these groups that a lot of people are not aware of. Are you aware of the collaboration between jihad groups and the most extreme white supremacy militias?
Yes, I am. And in fact, I'm not surprised by it. All you have to do is look what the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, for instance, did during the Second World War and in the 30s. He supported Hitler. You know, in other words, the extremists among Muslims saw in Hitler and in his belief that you know, that people of certain beliefs should dominate the world. He saw this as really being in harmony with the extreme Muslim views of the world also. So no, I'm not surprised. They also believe in violence.
Yes.
They believe that violence is the way to gain power, that it is actually very legitimate if you have a superior, you know, race. And in this case, they believe they do have a superior race. And if they have a belief system that is ordained by God. In the case of the extreme Muslim people, that's what they think. And of course, Hitler thought it was a huge sort of plan for the universe, really, for the Aryan race to dominate and rule the world. But the truth is that these folks really are very much alike.
That makes so much sense. And my channel specifically, the work I do is specifically focused on narcissistic dynamics. And it just fits perfectly. Like, these people will sometimes on the surface hate each other and have no clear alliance. But when it comes to, you know, creating mayhem, distress, targeting innocent people, they will be the best of friends. So that, you know, that makes a whole lot of sense to me.
One of the best ways, one of the best ways to be a friend is to have a common enemy.
Yeah.
And that's what they are. I mean, they have these common enemies.
Right. Right. Wow. That's fantastic. This conversation, Dr. Stanton, has been just unbelievably eye-opening to me today. I can't thank you enough. And I'm curious, where can people go to find out not only more information, but maybe if they're watching this and they're kind of feeling like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I fell into this. I'm so embarrassed. You know, I can kind of speak for myself at some of the times too, that I was like, did I actually believe that? What was I thinking? And, you know, where can people, like, how can people find out more information so that they aren't going further down these rabbit holes and that they can get away from this type of toxic mess?
Well, one thing to keep in mind also is most people who voted for Trump don't believe this.
Absolutely.
You know, the truth is, most Republicans are very good people. I know, because I grew up mostly with Republicans out there in the middle of the Midwest. And, you know, I remember, I think my American history teacher in high school was the only Democrat I knew. But the truth is, most Republicans are very reasonably ordinary people.
Absolutely.
And in fact, Republicans over the many years we've had some very good leaders who are Republicans. So, you know, I think of Teddy Roosevelt as one of our greatest presidents, for instance. So it is not a question of party, of political party.
Agreed.
But what it is being aware of the tendency towards ethnocentrism that we have as human beings. We grow up in a certain culture with a certain language, and we grow up in a certain nation and so forth. So when people put those things together and form a racist nationalism, as the Nazis did, or a religious nationalism, as some of the you know, Christian nationalists here in this country are trying to do, it's a potent combination. It's very, very attractive to people. So what I would argue here is, you know, look for organizations that really see this clearly, and look at their websites, get their publications. I, for instance, think a huge amount of the Southern Poverty Law Center here in the United States, who went after the Ku Klux Klan. And believe me, I know that especially because I was a civil rights worker in Mississippi in 1966. And the Ku Klux Klan used to follow us around. And one night they shot up our house. They wounded a couple of my friends. And it was right after the Klan had murdered, you know, the people in Philadelphia, just the next county over and buried them in an earthen dam. That crime still hadn't been solved then. But here we were in the heart of racist Mississippi. But I knew from having grown up in, Northern Illinois, that there were plenty of people in Northern Illinois who shared the views of the people there too, that blacks were inferior, that somehow they should be on the other side of the tracks. You shouldn't date a black person. I never forget, for instance, when we had a secretary of our senior class in high school, and I had grown up with her. I had known her since third grade. And I don't know, one day we were talking, after school or something, and I said, let's go to this movie, because there was a movie I thought would be particularly relevant to both of us. It was probably Sidney Poitier or something, And she said, well, let me think about this. And she came back the next day, and she said, I talked it over with my family, but I don't think it's a good idea. So we didn't go out together to that movie. But the next summer, I had a band in high school. I played the bass, and we used to, hire out to play for church socials and, go over to the country club for people to dance and stuff like this. Well, a lady came up to me, who was a member of my father's church, and she said to me, I hear you invited Glenda Powell out for a date. And I said, well, yeah, actually I did, but we didn't go because we just didn't think it was a good idea. And she looked me in the eye and she said, well, Gregory, I am ashamed of you. And for once in my life, I thought of the right thing to say. I looked her in the eye and I said, well, Mrs. Lipke, I'm ashamed of you. Good. Because we have to overcome this racism that's so deep in our society, and not just in the United States, but all around the world. Africans can be just as racist against each other as white people can be against black people. I mean, you just look at Rwanda with Tutsis and Hutus. I mean, so we have to overcome this racism, and we have to overcome our nationalism. If we don't overcome our nationalism, we're going to still have more wars, and we cannot afford to have more wars in an era when we already have nuclear weapons. So I would ask people to look at the internet sources of the truth, frankly, of about us as human beings, that there's only one race, the human race. And if we start thinking there's more than that, we're being misled. So look at the Southern Poverty Law Center, look at Genocide Watch, genocidewatch.com. That's our website. I don't know how many items there are up there now, certainly thousands and thousands, but we're trying to educate the public about the causes of genocide and about places where there's dangers of it. And one of those places is, in fact, the United States. I'm not predicting a genocide in the United States. I'm just predicting that some of the forces that lead to genocide are already here. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being with me today, Dr. Stanton. Thank you for the incredible work that you're doing. I can't wait to send folks over to check out your amazing website. And I'm just honored and feel very blessed that you could join me today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.